The transport ship slid quietly through the dark of space, its engines humming with a steady rhythm. Inside, rows of young cadets sat strapped into their seats, eyes fixed on the glowing symbols flashing across the cabin wall. Most of them were, from different corners of the galaxy, scaled, furred, armored, and feathered creatures, each wearing the crisp gray uniform of the Interspecies Academy. And in the middle of them, almost blending into the crowd but never truly invisible, sat the only human cadet. The journey to the academy had been long. For the human, it wasn't just about reaching a school, it was about stepping into a place where every movement would be watched, judged, and measured. Humanity had only recently been accepted into the galactic community, and not everyone agreed with that decision. Whispers followed the human everywhere. Deathworlder, they called them, a word heavy with meaning, half respect and half fear. To other species, Earth was a brutal place where life was a constant fight, and anyone who survived there was seen as dangerous by nature. But the cadet sitting on that ship wasn't here to frighten anyone. They were here to learn, to prove that humans could belong among the stars, not as wild survivors, but as disciplined guardians of peace. When the ship landed, the cadets were ordered to step out in neat rows. The academy loomed before them, a vast structure of silver towers and black stone, its spires reaching into the sky like blades. Training fields stretched out around it, glowing under bright floodlights. The air smelled sharp and clean, like metal and ozone. Every step echoed on the smooth floor as the cadets marched inside. The human kept their head high, eyes steady, shoulders squared. They knew every look was on them. A group of tall reptilian cadets hissed quietly, their forked tongues flicking in disdain. Some insectoid recruits chattered to each other, their many eyes darting toward the human, and then away as if staring too long might be dangerous. Even a few instructors paused, their expressions unreadable, but their silence heavy. The first days of training began immediately. Physical tests, endurance drills, memory challenges, combat exercises, each designed to push the cadets past their limits. For the human, the training was tough, but not impossible. They had grown up running through forests, climbing rocks, and learning to endure pain that came with scraped knees and hard lessons. While some species were faster or stronger in bursts, the human's persistence began to stand out. During a long-distance endurance run across the academy's training field, one cadet after another dropped out, panting, scales and fur slick with sweat. The human kept going, step after step, even when their legs burned and lungs ached. They finished not first, but among the few who endured to the end. The instructors noted it with silent interest. Some of the alien cadets frowned. In close quarters, combat training, the difference became even clearer. The academy provided simulation weapons, harmless batons meant for practice. Many species fought with brute strength, swinging wildly, relying on size. The human, though smaller, moved differently. They ducked, dodged, and struck with precision, never wasting energy. When paired against opponents who underestimated them, the human often landed clean hits, surprising even themselves. But victory never came without cost. After sparring, bruises bloomed on their skin, aches spread through their muscles, and sometimes their body shook from exhaustion. Still, they showed up every day. That persistence unsettled others more than any single strike. Off the field, things weren't easier. The cafeteria was filled with whispers whenever the human entered. Trays of alien food gave off strange smells, sharp, sweet, bitter, burning the nose. The human picked carefully at meals, adjusting slowly to the unfamiliar tastes. Some cadets stared openly, their expressions twisted between curiosity and contempt. A few mocked openly. Fragile, one sneered in a language the human didn't understand fully, but the tone was clear. The human didn't respond. They focused on their food, chewing slowly, calm on the outside even as something inside twisted. They hadn't come here to argue. They had come to prove themselves. Nights in the dormitory were long. Rows of sleeping pods lined the walls, humming softly. The human lay awake more often than not, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breaths of the other cadets. Loneliness pressed in harder than any physical trial. Home was light years away, and here, surrounded by beings who doubted them, every small victory felt like it had to be carved out with blood and sweat. Still, there were moments of quiet pride. One afternoon, during a climbing exercise on the academy's vertical wall, many cadets struggled with the sudden shifts in gravity the instructors activated. Clawed species dug into the surface, but slipped when the pull changed. The human, though slower, adjusted instinctively, finding handholds, swinging their weight, moving with rhythm. When they reached the top, arms trembling, they caught sight of an instructor nodding almost imperceptibly before turning away. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The human learned quickly that the academy wasn't just about training the body, it was about learning how to carry yourself. Under constant scrutiny, every mistake was magnified. Every success was questioned. If another cadet stumbled, it was seen as normal. If the human stumbled, it was proof of weakness. If another cadet excelled, it was talent. If the human excelled, it was suspicious. Despite that, they kept moving forward. One evening, after a long day of drills, the human walked back toward the dormitory. The path was quiet, lit only by the pale glow of overhead lights. From behind, a group of cadets followed, their voices low but sharp. The human could feel the weight of their eyes, the rising tension. But nothing happened that night. The group only laughed and walked past, but the message was clear. The human wasn't welcome. The academy was testing more than skill. It was testing patience, discipline, and resilience. And though the human felt the pressure building around them, they also felt something else growing inside. A quiet strength, a readiness. Days turned into weeks. The cadets were slowly shaped into something harder, sharper. And the human knew. One thing for certain, sooner or later the real test would come. It wouldn't be on the training field under the eyes of instructors. It would come when no one was watching, when whispers turned into action, when fear turned into a challenge. For now, though, the human endured, step by step, breath by breath, quiet, steady, unyielding. Because survival wasn't new to them. Survival was what humans had always done. And though no one said it aloud, a question lingered in the air of the academy. How long could one human really last among so many who wished to see them fall? The answer was coming, but not yet. For now, the human simply arrived, silent, watchful, carrying the weight of their entire species on their shoulders, determined not to break. Training at the academy only grew harder with each passing week. The instructors didn't slow down, not even for a moment. Every day started before the first light touched the sky, with cadets standing in neat rows on the field, their breath visible in the cold morning air. From that moment until late at night, there was no pause. Drills, lessons, tests, and punishments for the smallest mistakes. For the human, this rhythm was punishing, but it was familiar in its own way. Back home, life had always been about pushing through discomfort, about continuing even when tired or in pain. That background gave them something the others didn't expect, a stubborn will to keep going long after strength seemed spent. But persistence wasn't enough to win hearts. The other cadets noticed the human more with every day. Some watched with curiosity, but many more watched with resentment. Whispers followed them down the halls, across the mess hall, and even onto the training grounds. Fragile, some muttered. Others hissed words that translated roughly to beast or dangerous animal. To most, the human was a puzzle, someone too weak to be respected, yet too tough to be dismissed. The unease showed most clearly during combat training. Whenever the human was paired with another cadet, the room grew quieter. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Some matches ended quickly, with larger cadets overwhelming the human through sheer size. Others ended in surprise when the human ducked under a strike, twisted out of a hold, or landed a clean hit that stunned their opponent. Those surprises didn't make the human popular. If anything, they fueled the fire. Losing to another species was one thing. It happened often, and no one cared much. But losing to a human, a so-called Deathworlder? That burned. That left pride wounded. The instructors noticed the tension, though they never addressed it directly. Their job wasn't to ease personal conflicts. Their job was to shape warriors. The human felt the stares every day. In the cafeteria, they chose the corner seat, away from the loudest groups. Their tray was usually half full, the strange alien meals still unfamiliar. Sometimes another cadet would pass by and accidentally bump the table, spilling water, or knocking food. The human cleaned it up quietly, never rising to the bait. But silence didn't erase the message. You don't belong here. Still, the human didn't leave. They couldn't. They had come here to carry more than their own name. They carried the weight of their species, the silent challenge of proving that humans deserved a place among the stars. Walking away would mean more than quitting. It would mean failure for all of humanity. That thought kept them steady. But the tension was growing, and everyone could feel it. During a long simulation drill in the zero-gravity chamber, the human was teamed with 3 others. The mission was simple: secure a floating beacon while avoiding. Simulated drones. It was meant to teach teamwork. The human worked carefully, positioning themselves to cover blind spots, suggesting quick strategies. But their words were ignored. "Stay out of the way," one of the cadets snapped. So the human fell back, letting them take charge. But when the beacon was nearly captured, one of the drones slipped through and tagged their leader, ending the mission. Everyone spun toward the human. "Why didn't you cover that angle?" one accused. The human's jaw tightened. They had been ready to, but they hadn't been allowed to move. Saying that wouldn't matter. Instead, they simply nodded, accepting the blame in silence. The loss wasn't big, but it left a bitter taste. Later that night, the whispers grew louder. Groups gathered in corners, voices sharp. The human walked past them on the way to the dormitory, catching fragments. Doesn't belong. Weak. Lucky hits. Needs to be taught. It was no longer just whispers of dislike. It was turning into something heavier. Even so, the humans stayed focused on the training. They spent extra hours practicing strikes alone in the corner of the gym, repeating movements until sweat soaked their uniform. They ran extra laps around the training grounds even when their legs felt like fire. If the others saw this, they only shook their heads. Some mocked quietly. "Trying too hard," they muttered. But the instructors saw too, and though they didn't show it openly, their eyes lingered a little longer. The tension finally cracked one evening during weapons training. Each cadet was handed a staff for practice. Matches were fast and meant to teach defense. When the human's turn came, they were paired against a tall cadet with plated skin and long arms. From the moment the match began, the opponent attacked with unusual aggression. The staff slammed down again and again, faster and harder than the usual drills. The human blocked, dodged, absorbed the strikes, but each hit rattled their bones. The opponent wasn't training, they were trying to break them. The human's arms ached, their breath came fast, and still the strikes came. At last, the instructor called the match. The human lowered their staff, bruised but standing. Their opponent sneered, muttered something sharp, and walked away without a glance back. The room buzzed. Everyone had seen it. It wasn't training anymore. It was the beginning of something else. After that day, the air around the human thickened like a storm waiting to break. Every glance carried weight. Every laugh felt pointed. The human knew it wasn't a matter of if something would happen, it was a matter of when. And yet, they didn't let fear take root. They had been tested before, in forests and cities back home, in storms and in long nights when no help was coming. Pressure wasn't new, but this was different. This wasn't about surviving nature. This was about facing hostility in the middle of a place that was supposed to train unity. One night, as the dormitory lights dimmed and silence fell, the human lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Muscles ached, bruises throbbed, but their mind was sharper than ever. They could sense the challenge building, the weight of it pressing in. Somewhere in the dark, whispers traded back and forth, and faint laughter echoed. The human closed their eyes, steadying their breath. They didn't know when the storm would break or how hard it would hit, but deep down, they knew something important. When it came, they wouldn't run, because running had never been the human way. And in the quiet of that night, as the academy slept, the tension wrapped tighter and tighter around them, preparing. The stage for the moment everyone knew was coming. The human wasn't just surviving anymore, they were waiting for the spark, waiting for the clash that would decide whether they would remain a shadow in the academy or prove, once and for all, that humans could not be broken. The days at the academy carried on, each one blending into the next with drills, tests, and long nights of study. But beneath the routine, there was a growing tension, a weight that pressed heavier on the human with every passing hour. They could feel it when they walked through the halls, when conversations stopped suddenly as they entered, when pairs of eyes followed their every move. It was clear now. Something was coming. The human had learned to live with unease. Back home, life had often demanded alertness. A rustle in the woods could mean a predator. A shifting wind could mean a storm. A single mistake could mean the difference between safety and danger. That instinct carried into the academy, sharpening every sense. The others thought the humans' eyes simply moved too much, scanning the corners. But the truth was simple. They were preparing. The ambush didn't happen right away. It built slowly, like a storm gathering behind clouds. There were small signs first, a misplaced item from their locker, a spilled drink that was no accident, laughter that followed them out of a training hall. The instructors never noticed, or maybe they chose not to. To them, this was part of the test, how a cadet held themselves under pressure. The human bore it quietly. They didn't answer insults with insults, and they didn't rise to provocation. But silence only encouraged those who wanted more. The breaking point came after a long, grueling day of combat practice. Everyone's muscles ached, their uniforms clung with sweat, and tempers were short. The human had pushed themselves harder than most, staying longer on the mats even after the session ended, running through drills until their arms trembled. When they finally left the training hall, the corridors were nearly empty, the academy quiet as the evening meal drew others to the mess hall. That was when it began. A faint sound echoed behind them. Footsteps, too many to be coincidence. The human slowed, listening. The steps slowed too. A chill moved down their spine. They turned a corner into one of the storage halls, its lights dimmer than the main corridors. Rows of crates and equipment lined the walls, shadows stretching long. And then the footsteps quickened. The human didn't have to look back to know. This was it. Figures closed in, blocking the exit behind. More emerged from the side corridors, stepping into the pale light. Their faces carried no friendliness, only the sharp edge of challenge. 7 of them in total, surrounding, tightening. The circle. The human's heartbeat quickened, but their hands stayed loose at their sides. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. One stepped forward, voice low but sharp. "You don't belong here." It wasn't the first time those words had been spoken, but tonight they carried more than insult. They carried intent. The humans, Eyes scanned quickly. The circle was tight, too close to simply slip away. The crates offered cover but no escape. They were trapped, and everyone knew it. Another cadet sneered, adding, "You think you're better than us? Always pushing harder? Showing off in training, you need to be reminded of your place." The human didn't answer right away. Instead, they straightened slightly, meeting each gaze in turn. Inside, the decision was already made. Running wasn't possible. Talking would change nothing. All that was left was to endure. Silence stretched, heavy and charged. The seven shifted, waiting for a reaction. None came. And then the first moved. It was quick, a shove, meant to throw the human against the wall. But the human had been ready. They sidestepped, letting the push carry its own momentum. The cadet stumbled forward, caught off guard, and the human simply stepped back into position, still calm, still steady. The others hissed in surprise. This wasn't how it was supposed to start. Another lunged, swinging low. The human blocked. Instinctively, the strike rattling through their arms, but not breaking their stance. They pushed back just enough to show they would not fall easily, and that was all it took. The circle erupted into motion, 7 against 1. A test not of strength, but of will. The human moved with a focus born from survival. Every step was measured, every motion conserving energy. They didn't waste time on wild strikes. Instead, they deflected, sidestepped, redirected. A hand on a shoulder spun one attacker into another. A quick duck let a blow sail overhead, striking empty air. The storage hall filled with the sound of boots on metal floors, of breaths sharp with effort, of frustration rising as strike after strike missed its target. The human wasn't untouched. A hit glanced against their ribs, sending pain sharp through their side. Another caught their arm, leaving it throbbing. But still they stood, absorbing, enduring. What surprised the others most wasn't the human's speed or skill. It was the calm. No wild shouting, no fear in their eyes, just steady focus, the kind of focus that came from someone who had faced worse before. Seconds stretched long. To the attackers it felt endless. To the human, it was survival in motion. Finally, in the swirl of movement, one cadet stumbled, breath ragged, chest heaving. Another backed away for just a moment, catching their breath. One by one, cracks formed in the circle. The human saw it. Not victory, but something close enough. They shifted their stance, shoulders squared, eyes steady. Their chest rose and fell. With heavy breaths, bruises already forming, but their legs were firm beneath them, and in that stance, in that silence, the message became clear. I am not breaking. The seven didn't retreat all at once. Pride wouldn't allow it, but hesitation had taken root. Their strikes slowed, their glares less sharp. The human had not been beaten, and that truth hung heavier than any blow. The moment stretched, and then slowly the group began to pull back. One by one they stepped away, muttering under their breath, anger burning but respect, however reluctant, beginning to flicker in the shadows of their eyes. The human didn't chase them. They didn't speak. They simply stayed standing, bruised, but unbroken, until the last footsteps faded from the hall. Only then did they allow their body to sag slightly, breath rushing out in a heavy sigh. Pain throbbed through every muscle, every bruise, but deep down, beneath the ache, there was something else, something solid. They had been tested, cornered, outnumbered, and still they stood. The ambush had been meant to break them, to remind them of their place. Instead, it had revealed something none of the others could ignore. Humans did not fall easily, and as the human leaned against a crate, steadying their breath, they knew the storm wasn't over. There would be whispers again, sharper than before. There would be eyes watching more closely than ever, but there would also be something new. Respect. It wouldn't come openly, not yet. But it had been planted in that dim hall, in the clash of 7 against 1, and as the human gathered themselves and walked back into the bright corridors of the academy, every step echoed with the same quiet truth. This was only the beginning. The storage hall felt emptier once the 7 figures had left, their footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the academy's corridors. For a moment, the human stood there alone, leaning against one of the crates, chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. Pain spread slowly through their body, blooming like fire beneath the skin. Their ribs ached from a strike, their arms were heavy, and bruises had already begun to form. But despite the pain, there was no regret in their eyes. They had stood their ground. The fight hadn't been about winning in the usual sense. It wasn't about throwing the hardest punch or knocking anyone down. It was about endurance, about refusing to bend even when the odds were impossible. And that was exactly what the human had done. Still, the aftermath carried its own weight. They knew this wouldn't simply disappear into silence. 7 cadets had failed to do what they thought would be easy. Pride had been wounded, and whispers would spread faster than fire in dry grass. The human pushed themselves upright, forcing their legs to move despite the ache. Each step toward the exit was careful, steady. The corridors outside were brighter, filled with the faint sound of voices from the mess hall. They walked past quickly, not wanting to draw attention, though they knew some would notice the stiffness in their stride, the shadows of bruises that training gear couldn't fully hide. When they reached their quarters, the door shut with a quiet hiss. Inside, the silence pressed close. The humans sat down slowly, untying their boots with careful hands. They checked their ribs, wincing as they pressed against the tender spot. Nothing broken, but the bruise would deepen by morning. For a while, they simply sat there, letting the stillness wash over them. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its place. But alongside the exhaustion was something else: clarity. The academy was not just about drills and lessons. It was about survival of a different kind. It tested the mind as much as the body. And in that dim hall, surrounded and outnumbered, the human had passed a test that no instructor had written down. Word of what had happened spread quickly, though no one admitted to starting the whispers. By the next day, cadets glanced at the human differently. Some with suspicion, others with quiet curiosity, and a few with something that almost looked like respect. Conversations stopped abruptly when the human entered a room. The laughter that had once followed them down hallways was quieter now, replaced by whispers spoken behind hands. The 7 who had attacked didn't speak openly about it. Pride held their tongues, but their silence said enough. None of them looked the human in the eye. When drills paired them together, their strikes lacked the same confidence. They were careful now, hesitant in a way they hadn't been before. The instructors, sharp-eyed as always, noticed the change. Though no one officially reported the ambush, they weren't blind. They saw the bruises, the way cadets shifted uneasily around the human, the way tensions hung in the air. They didn't ask questions. Instead, they watched more closely, as if waiting to see what would come next. For the human, the days that followed were heavy with silence. They trained harder, pushing their body despite the soreness that lingered. Each bruise was a reminder not of weakness, but of survival. And each drill was another chance to show what endurance meant. There were no boasts, no attempts to retell the ambush in their own words. The human didn't need to. The story told itself in the way others avoided their gaze, in the way the training mats grew quieter when they stepped forward, in the way the whispers spread like shadows along the walls. But silence didn't mean peace. At night, lying in their bunk, the human thought about what had happened. They replayed every movement, every choice. Could they have ended it differently? Could they have spoken instead of fought? The questions came, but the answers never stayed. The truth was, it hadn't been a matter of choice. When surrounded, when escape was cut off, when the circle closed. Tight, survival demanded more than words, and survival had been achieved. Yet deep down, the human also knew something else. This wasn't the end of the storm. It was only the eye, the calm space before the next wave. Days stretched into a rhythm. Training, studying, sleeping, all under the quiet hum of tension that never fully left. The human kept their focus sharp, their senses alert because they understood what others didn't want to admit. Moments like the ambush had a way of repeating themselves. Pride had been hurt, and hurt pride often returned in new forms. Still, the atmosphere was changing. Slowly, in small ways, cracks in the wall of hostility began to show. One evening, while leaving the training hall, a cadet walked past the human and gave a single short nod. Nothing more, nothing less. But in that tiny gesture, there was acknowledgement. Another time, while practicing drills, a partner who once ignored them now kept pace, watching carefully as if trying to learn from the human's endurance. Respect was not spoken aloud, but it was growing, inch by inch. The human noticed, but they didn't lean into it. They stayed quiet, letting actions speak louder than words. Every time they rose after a hard fall on the mats, every time they carried their own weight without complaint, every time they endured longer than expected, the unspoken truth grew clearer. Humans were not weak. They were resilient. But the aftermath wasn't just about the reactions of others. It was also about the human's own reflection. Alone in their quarters, they thought about home, about the harsh lessons learned in a place where the weather, the land, and even the nights could be unforgiving. Those lessons had followed them here, shaping every instinct, every choice. Back then, survival had meant carrying on no matter what. Now, in the academy, the meaning hadn't changed. They realized something important. The ambush hadn't just tested them, it had revealed them. It had shown not only to the 7 attackers, but to everyone watching from the shadows what it meant to be human. The bruises faded over time, though some aches lingered longer than others. But long after the pain eased, the memory stayed. Not as a wound, but as a mark of strength. In the end, the aftermath wasn't about silence or whispers. It was about what had been proven. That night in the storage hall, surrounded and outnumbered, the human had stood unbroken. And that truth was heavier than any rumor, stronger than any attempt to push them down. Because once others have seen endurance in action, they cannot unsee it. The human carried that truth with them in every step, every drill, every quiet moment of reflection. And while others whispered and wondered, they simply prepared for whatever test would come next. The storm wasn't over, but the human was ready. The academy had gone back to its usual rhythm. Days blended together, morning drills, physical training, weapon practice, and long hours in the classrooms where strategy was written on glowing screens. To most cadets, the ambush in the storage hall had become just another rumor in the long list of academy stories. But to the human, it wasn't a rumor. It was a memory, etched deep, a moment that kept echoing even as the days marched forward. For many, the fight was the ending. But for the human, it was the beginning of a lesson. The bruises had healed. The soreness in the ribs and shoulders was gone. The body had recovered as it always did. Yet the mind stayed sharp, awake in the silence of nights when others slept. They thought about what had happened, about the circle of 7, the heavy fists, the storm of anger, and how 9 seconds had stretched into something much larger than just a clash. It had shown the humans something important about themselves and about the academy. The first part of the lesson was simple. Strength was not about size, nor about numbers. The 7 attackers had been larger, stronger in appearance, and confident in their advantage. Yet confidence had cracked when faced with resistance. The human realized that strength was not measured by how hard one could hit, but by how long one could stand when everything seemed against them. That lesson stayed close, like a quiet voice, reminding them that survival was not always about overpowering an enemy, but about outlasting them. The second part of the lesson was about respect. It could not be demanded, it could not be begged for. It had to be earned, often through pain, through actions that spoke louder than words ever could. The whispers around the academy were proof enough. No one praised the human openly, but the air had shifted. Where once there had been mocking laughter, now there was space. Space created by respect. The human learned that respect often comes not when you chase it, but when you stand firm in silence and let the world see what you are made of. The third part of the lesson went deeper. It was about fear, not their own, but others. The cadets who had attacked now looked away, not because they had forgiven or forgotten, but because they were afraid. Not afraid of more bruises or broken pride, but of something more subtle, the realization that the smallest, seemingly weakest one among them had a spirit they couldn't bend. That kind of fear was different. It wasn't about fists or force. It was about the unknown, about not understanding how someone could keep standing when logic said they should fall. The human understood then that fear is not always created by loudness or threats. Sometimes it is created by quiet strength, the kind that cannot be broken. Each of these lessons was not written down, not taught in class, but they became part of the human's way of thinking. They carried them into every drill, every practice, every sparring match. When they stood on the training mats and faced an opponent, they no longer just thought about movements or strikes. They thought about the deeper truth, that the fight was never only physical. It was about will, and will could outlast anything. Others began to notice. Instructors who once overlooked the human's presence now watched carefully. When assignments were given, the human was placed in positions where endurance was needed. During long-distance marches across harsh terrain, the human kept moving, long after others slowed. During survival tests, when food was scarce and exhaustion grew heavy, the human adapted, finding ways to keep going. The lesson of the storage hall had become the lesson of the academy. Endure, and others will see. There were still cadets who disliked them, still those who muttered behind their backs, but it no longer mattered. The human had stopped worrying about acceptance. They had stopped worrying about belonging in the way others did. Belonging, they realized, was not something granted by a group. It was something earned by proving again and again who you were, when tested. And this was the greatest part of the lesson. One night, while sitting alone in the mess hall after most had left, the human thought about home again. About the hard winters where food ran thin, about the long days of labor, about the times when storms had made survival uncertain. Back then, no one had come to help, no one had handed them strength. They had learned to push forward on their own. The academy wasn't different. It was just a harsher, louder version of the same truth. Life doesn't give you an easy path. It tests you, sometimes unfairly, sometimes brutally, and the only thing that truly matters is whether you can endure, whether you can stand when standing feels impossible. That was the lesson they carried. Weeks later, another test came, though this one was official. The cadets were sent into simulated combat as a group, assigned roles in a scenario where teamwork decided survival. The human was placed at the center, holding a position others thought was unimportant. But when the simulation turned chaotic, when stronger cadets faltered under pressure, it was the human who refused to yield. They held their ground, drawing others back into formation, enduring wave after wave until the test ended. When the results were shown, it wasn't the humans' strength that stood out, but their endurance. The instructors noted it plainly. When others broke, they remained. And though no one clapped, no one cheered. Everyone remembered. The lesson had spread beyond the human. Others began to understand. They saw that power was not always about size, that survival came from within, and that respect was shaped by action, not words. For the human, it was enough. They didn't need praise. They didn't need fame. What mattered was simple. They had proven to themselves and to everyone else that even in the darkest moments, even when outnumbered, a human spirit could not be bent so easily. The night of the ambush became more than just a memory. It became a marker, a turning point. And though time would blur the details for others, the human would never forget, because the bruises had healed, the whispers had faded, but the lesson remained. The lesson that one person's will could stand against many. The lesson that true strength was not found in dominance, but in resilience. The lesson that respect, once earned, could not be erased. And above all, the lesson that no matter how heavy the storm, humanity's power was not in how loudly it roared, but in how quietly it endured. That was the truth the human carried. And it was the truth they would carry long after the academy, long after the storage hall faded into history. For storms come and go, battles rise and fall, but lessons, the eyes, real ones, stay forever.